Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Delaware Valley University. Yeah, we'll take it. So I just wanted to say a few things. My name is Dr. Jackie Ricotta. I'm chair of plant sciences and landscape architecture here. This presentation tonight is brought to you by the One Health speaker series. One Health is a multidisciplinary approach that works locally, regionally, nationally, and globally to attain well-being for people and society, the environment, plants, and animals. So we do have a One Health speaker series. There are many talks throughout the entire year. You can sign up by either signing your name to, there is a form up here if you want to receive emails, or going to the www.delval.edu One Health website to see all of the different speakers that come throughout the year, many of them on Zoom, so you can enjoy it from your own home. This talk is also brought to you by the Henry Schmieder Arboretum. If you didn't know, Delaware Valley University is an arboretum here on campus. We are part of America's Garden Capital group that is in the Philadelphia region for botanical gardens and arboreta. And finally, I'd like to, this talk tonight is brought to you by the Bucks County Food Shed Alliance, and I'd like to introduce Robin Hoy from the BCFA. So thank you so much for being here, and enjoy Dr. Doug Tallamy.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Dr. Ricotta. We are so appreciative of Del Val's co-hosting this event with the Food Shed Alliance. We've had a long history of the agricultural community and Delaware Valley University collaborating here in Bucks, and we're delighted to welcome you all tonight to hear this great speaker. I want to first thank our generous sponsors, Holland Floor Covering, a local family-run flooring company with an excellent reputation for service and quality, and the Penn State Extension Master Gardeners, Kind Earth Growers, Kimberton Whole Foods, Lebowski Law Firm, and Archer and Greiner Attorneys at Law. We also hope you had a chance at the reception to check out the tables of our community partner sponsors and local native plant nurseries and designers. We have a rich community of native plant supporters here. And we hope you had a chance to taste the delicious refreshments provided by our local farmers and chefs from Fancy Fig and Aurora Bistro. Please support all these generous community members. We at the Food Shed Alliance are truly grateful for the community support that makes it possible for us to help new farmers get started with small farm grants, for our farmers markets to thrive, for us to help our food insecure neighbors, to host our free summer farm tours, and for us all to have healthy, sustainably farmed food available in our community. Thank you all. Tonight, we're focusing on a different way we can all help to support the healthy ecosystems that we all rely upon. I'm honored to be introducing Dr. Doug Tallamy, who will tell us all about it. Dr. Tallamy is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He has authored more than 100 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 44 years. He's a prolific and entertaining writer, as you know who have read his books. His book, Nature's Best Hope, is a New York Times bestseller, and his book, The Nature of Oaks, is the winner of the American Horticulture Society's 2022 Book Award. Other awards he's received that he didn't want me to mention include recognition from the Garden Writers Association, the Audubon Society, the National Wildlife Federation, Eco-Foresters, the Garden Club America, the Herb Society, and the American Horticulture Society. I am truly delighted to welcome Dr. Doug Tallamy.
Well, thanks very much. This is the first talk I have given since I got my new hearing aids. And I can tell you, it's loud. I signed a book to a woman named Gloria out there, Gloria, Gloria, and I can't get that song out of my head. So I don't know how this talk's going to go. All right, well, let's talk about nature's best hope, or at least my idea of nature's best hope. And I'll give you a spoiler, you're nature's best hope. So I'm really going to talk about why I think so. Before I do that, though, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. The great E.O. Wilson from Harvard, extremely long career, the late, great E.O. Wilson. He died 2 years ago. But one thing that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of life on planet Earth and his efforts to save it. And he wanted to save it not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it's going to disappear everywhere, and that includes humans. Very bold statement. He spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement, and then he ended the book. He didn't spend very much time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and all those things that are in trouble can be in that half. We'll be in the other half, and it'll be great. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. I don't see that disappearing anytime soon. And we've got 8.2 billion people in the other half, along with all of our hardscape, our roadways, our airports, and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? I think we can, and that's actually what I want to talk about tonight. But we need a new approach to conservation to do that. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about oak masts. This is a big oak mast in 2019, and we get them every couple of years. This one was primarily the red oak group. Members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And that's what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. But I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. And once it's out of the acorn, it's a dangerous time for that insect larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. That takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa, and then surprisingly stays in that underground chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do. That's actually an extension of the head capsule. The mouth parts are way down there at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts and they chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? I don't think about the next year the way most insects would. Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they come out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum. And Aristotle told us that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she's filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they have left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. Grab the larvae, grab the eggs, move the entire colony into the new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. And after they're in there, they post a guard, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until that acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants, that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn, they'll fly up to a mile, maybe a mile and a half from the parent tree. Then they tap it below the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. And a single jay can bury 4,500 acorns every fall. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants. You won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have facilia. That is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We got between 3,600 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could go on and on talking about nature-specialized relationships, but the point I want to make tonight is that actually most of these relationships these days, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the country, particularly the lower 48 states, as it was. There's only about 5% of the country that's relatively pristine, and those are typically mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it, we have drained it, we have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland out there. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to contain the amount of nature that E.O. Wilson says we need to survive ourselves. Edwin Wade Teal, decades ago, said we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It's the most basic common sense. But we are doing that. Why have we done this? I don't know, but I suspect we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we're wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. And unless you are a billionaire, let me remind you, a billion is 1,000 million. So we have lost 3,000 million birds in North America in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. The UN's predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years, and they made that prediction 3 years ago. So I guess it's the next 17 years now. Now, it's a prediction. Hasn't happened yet. We have to make sure it doesn't happen, because again, those are the species that keep us alive on this planet. It is serious business. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and as Shakespeare would say, upon all of our houses. That's not what this talks about. This talks about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline, "The Insect Apocalypse is Here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth?" Back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what would happen if insects disappeared from planet Earth, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, "The Little Things That Run the World." And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, lots of nasty things would happen. First, most of our flowering plants would disappear, would go extinct. And if that happened, it would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse. We would lose our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And again, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that healthy ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Those are just a few things that plants do every day that we require every day. Like oxygen, plants are producing that oxygen. They're cleaning our water, slowing its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants, of course, are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their root systems. And once it's in the ground, it's extremely stable. Plants are building topsoil. They're holding it in place. They're preventing floods. They're dampening severe weather. They're converting sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight, and then we will lose weight. What do animals do for plants? A lot of things, but these are the important ones. They're providing pest control services. They're pollinating nearly 90% of the flowering plants. They're dispersing plant seeds. So designing landscapes like that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8.2 billion people demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves, and they're doing the best they can, but we are in the 6th great extinction event the planet has ever experienced, which means it's not good enough. So I think the solution is to start practicing conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like that. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another place, doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and mine and graze and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in his most famous book, The Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. We cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, and unfortunately it remains in our own culture, that he might not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Where shall we start? Well, I think we need to start on private property because most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the lower 48 states is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail, and failure is not an option. Now, when I use the word conservation, and I'm not using it exactly the way I mean, we do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there. That's been our conservation model for the last century, and we want to keep doing that. But it obviously hasn't been good enough. So we have to go beyond conservation into restoration. We have to put it back. We have to rebuild nature in as many places as we can. And I know there's a very strong argument out there saying there's no way you can put it back the way it was. And that may be true because we've changed too many things. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions I opened the talk with to create ecosystem function once again, even if it's not exactly what was in a particular place at some point in the past. But not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So if we're going to rebuild ecosystems, we have to start with the building blocks, the most powerful groups. And there's two groups we can't do without. One, of course, is the flowering plants and the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They're capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. So now we have the food that animals need locked up in plant tissues, mostly in leaves. If you don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. And if you don't have any animals, you don't have functional ecosystems. Well, it turns out that most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate those plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any old insect. Turns out that caterpillars are enormously important because they're transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. Dan Jansen, very famous ecologist, calls them the meat and potatoes or the bread and butter of terrestrial food webs. If we design landscapes without a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee that is at my house in Oxford, Pennsylvania. We're right next to the Maryland border. Up here, you might have transitioned into the black-capped chickadee, or right next to the edge of that transition. But they're practically the same bird doing the same things. What they're doing is coming to our feeders all winter long and eating seeds. So we tend to think that's all chickadees need is seeds. Well, even in the wintertime, only 50% of their diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they switch entirely to invertebrates, and if they are in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they're not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So, what is special about caterpillars? Well, it turns out several things are special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. So think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. But because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Beaks like a plunger. You just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and a lot of beetles have really sharp edges, too. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. We vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from, particularly during the breeding season? Well, from all those prey items they bring back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey items. Those two bars way over there, the tall ones, are caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. The adult caterpillars, the moths and butterflies themselves, have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way over here. So the earthworm gets a worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. And it turns out there's a direct relationship between how often a prey item is brought back to the nest and its carotenoid content. Caterpillars are brought back, come back, more than anything else, and they've got the highest carotenoid content, followed by orthopteroids, things like crickets and grasshoppers and katydids. And then everything else has far fewer carotenoids, and they're brought back far less often. So those studies and others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question, and it's an important one, is how many caterpillars do they need? Is one or two enough? Or one or two a day enough? It's a good question. So let's go back to Carolina chickadee. There's a lot of data on Carolina chickadee. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? One or two is not enough. 1 or 2 a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, to get the chicks in that nest to fledge, to get to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count them. But you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to get one nest of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of bird, through to independence. And of course, after they're independent from the parents, they keep eating caterpillars. And if you want chickadees to breed in your nest, you've got to have all those caterpillars in your yard, in your nest, in your yard. If you want them to breed in your yard, you've got to have all those caterpillars in your yard, because they only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And that is true for most of the birds out there. They forage very close to the nest. And if we landscape in a way that does not include all of those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group who said that we have lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups: the species that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like finches and doves and crossbills can actually make a little milk out of the seeds that they eat, and they can rear their young on that milk. And look, that group did not decline at all in the last 50 years. But the birds that require insects decline on average 10 million individuals per species. This does not prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. So I think we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing: be pretty. Now we're going to ask them to do 2 things: be pretty and ecologically functional at the same time. And that's not going to happen unless we put those caterpillars back. So how do you add caterpillars to a landscape? Well, you add the plants that support those caterpillars. Seems pretty straightforward. But there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we choose for our yards. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates this perfectly. You can have all of the crepe myrtle and all the privet and all the burning bush and all the ginkgos and all the hostas and all the things we typically landscape with in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization, and it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why is that? Well, plants have made them specialized. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction, so they have loaded their leaves with nasty-tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. There is a reason why it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, just like the monarch. They can only eat the plants for which they have adaptations that allow them to get around, to circumvent those plant defenses. They have specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify the plant chemicals. They have behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those toxic chemicals. But it takes a long period of interacting with those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. So if you move into your house and you take away the milkweeds that were there and replace them with hostas, the monarch's not going to start to eat hostas. It's locked into eating milkweeds. If you take away climbing fetterbush, the Okefenokee zale there, that beautiful caterpillar, is not going to be able to survive. It only eats climbing fetterbush. So it turns out there's 3 kinds of plants out there. Plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of the oaks. They are transferring more energy from 2 other animals up the food web than any other plant genus, by far. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo. Ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a nice ornamental tree, has good fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo. So it's not adding any energy to local food webs. And a good example of a detractor would be Callery pear, Bradford pear, or any of the invasive plants that we brought in from Asia. Not only are they not supporting caterpillars and other insects, but they're invasive species. They escape where we plant and invade natural areas, pushing out the native plants that do contribute to local food webs. So the end result is a loss of energy from that food web. We have measured what happens to caterpillar biomass and invasions like that, and it's a reduction of around 96%. So if you think of those caterpillars as bird food, you've just reduced bird food by 96%. So if you're wondering why birds are disappearing, that's one of the reasons. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. We cannot rebuild ecosystems if we don't have functional food webs in those ecosystems, and you cannot build a functional food web unless you choose the right plants. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well this works when you do choose the right plants, starting with what's happened at my house, at our house, where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000. There was a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots in Oxford, Pennsylvania. We got one of those lots. The last thing, it was a very old farm, been farmed for over 300 years, and the last thing they did was to mow it for hay. So very few plants there, and our job was to put it back together and to rebuild the eastern deciduous forest on this site, which we had never done before. We didn't know what we were doing. But one of the things I wanted to try was to put one of those host plants that I knew about into our yard and see whether the things that ate it came and use that plant. And the first one I tried was the Canadian owlet. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet before. That's what it looks like. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have their host plant specialization, which is meadow rue, and we didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure it was growing there 300 years ago before the area was farmed to death. But the meadow rue is long gone. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace, and I planted them, and they grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would appear out of nowhere and find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for maybe 2 months after I planted it. And then I was walking by for another reason, and I looked over. It was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of Canadian owlets and meadow rue. We've added 2 species to that barren landscape. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That is actually a misnomer. That beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa. But I did know where there was some Bidens in a power line cut in Bear, Delaware, about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds. I planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last year they took over my front yard. That's okay. I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Bidens, but they did. So now we have added 2 more species. We got a good population of Bidens and goldenrod stowaways, so we've added 4 species to the property. The restoration is underway. I want to see if the hackberry emperor can make a living at our house. Not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to occur at our yard, but as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I got a couple of hackberry trees, I planted them. Had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find my hackberry, but they did, and now we've got a good population of both of those, so we've added 6 species to the property, and that's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of moths that use goldenrod in the mid-Atlantic states. Very powerful plant. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear some people don't like it. I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover. It makes valuable berries for the birds in the fall. Where are they? They're up there somewhere. By valuable, I mean they're high in fat. Our migrating birds need sources of fat to fuel that migration, and our overwintering birds need sources of fat to help them get through the winter. And those berries come from tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know Virginia creeper's in bloom until you see a big cloud of native bees around it. Turns out it's a wonderful pollinator plant. So remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for supporting the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent to make a living at our house, just because it's such a cool-looking caterpillar. Even if you don't like caterpillars, which is hard to believe, but if you don't, you got to like this guy because it looks like a stegosaurus. Well, it's a specialist on elm, primarily American elm. And of course, we didn't have any American elm because we lost it to Dutch elm disease decades ago. But there are two big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. Every year they make a lot of seed. So the second year after we moved in, I gathered up some of the seed from the gutter, planted them at home. They germinate in 6 days, grow very quickly, and today those trees are over 80 feet tall. And yes, they brought in the double-toothed prominent, American elm. I want to see if I get the evening primrose moth to make a living in our house because they're beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, as their name suggests, they need evening primrose, and we didn't have any, so I planted it. The moth did come, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. Those are just examples of the plants we put back in our yard. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to local food webs, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, free. And immediately they started to call in the moths that create the caterpillars that run the food web at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactis, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more. I love it when you clap for the oaks. Hundreds more species have come to the oaks on our property, and look, they come right away. There's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of a pin oak that just popped its head above the ground. And people say, oh no, he's going to kill the tree. No, an ovenbird's going to come eat it in the next 20 minutes. It's part of the food web, and it starts to contribute the very first year. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for that to happen. Now, in the summertime, that's what our house is going to look like. Pictures taken from pretty much the same place I took the first picture. And the question is, has life returned? So we put some plants back. Not all of them, still working on it, but has life returned? Now, you can measure life any way you want. I measure it by counting the number of breeding birds, the birds that have nested on our property, and the number of moth species that are making a living on our property. Moths, not butterflies. Butterflies are day-flying, bad-tasting moths. They really are. They come right out in the middle of the moth lineage, and that's why they're flying during the day. They don't taste very good, which means they're not adding much to the local food web. So the creatures that really count are those moths, and I've been taking a picture of as many species of moths that I could find on our property. For the last 8 years, I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,000. Oh, that's outdated. It's 1,338. I got one the other night. 1,338 species of moths that are living on our 10 acres. Now, Pennsylvania's either 22.9 million acres or 29.2 million acres. I can never remember. We've got 10 acres. So on one tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the entire state, we've got 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state because we put the plants back. And because so many of those are types of bird food, we've recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why? Because we've got the bird food there. And we got the bird food because we put the plants back. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we see all the time. The World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn this around. But will it work on smaller properties? That's a very good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. Everybody's got the big lawns around them. When they moved into their yard, it was choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, another invasive species from Asia. So they got rid of that. Then they planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature that they call a bubbler, and then they started to count the birds using their yard. And they are up to 154 bird species, including 35 warbler species, an amazing number. Just to compare that to our house, we've only recorded 18 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. Her property abuts O'Hare Airport. She has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural area at all, so she's a tiny island in the middle of Chicago. It's a pretty island because Pam is a native plant landscaper and she knows what she's doing. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, added a water feature, and then she sat back, she says, with a glass of wine. I think it was more than one. And started counting the birds using her yard. She's up to 127 bird species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. Okay, there's 4 things we need to talk about if we're going to be successful, and we need to be successful. And one of them is talk about those big lawns we've got out there. We've got 44 million acres of lawn in this country, which is an area bigger than all of New England combined, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we do that? Well, lawn is a status symbol. It's a very important status symbol. We like neat. It's easy to keep lawns neat. And we need to display our Halloween decorations. I got a picture of a submarine parked in a lawn the other day, but I didn't put that in. Remember what every property has to do. There's 4 ecological goals of every single property. And one is to support a local food web. Another one is to sequester carbon, help climate change, manage the watershed in which every property lies, and support pollinators. Lawn does none of those things, which is why I pick on it. So let's think about reducing the area of lawn. We'll pick it out of the house. Let's say we're going to cut that area in half. We're going to take spaces like this and turn them into this. I got this picture from Dan Getman in Missouri. He had this great big lawn, and he said, I'm going to put some native plants in, so here's an early planting. Well, let's make the math simple. Let's say we've got 40 million acres of lawn. We're going to cut that in half. That's 20 million acres we can restore right at home, which is enough to make what I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country. What do you get when you put a park at home? What do you get when you put some part of nature right where you live? You get the opportunity to interact with it at your own time, your own pace. All you have to do is go outside, or maybe even just look out the window. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, last year 375 million people there with you, I know what you're really going to interact with. It's free, there's no admission fee, it's never closed no matter what government closure or pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. I think that alone is important, not mediated by somebody else, a personal interaction, unique interaction between you and Mother Nature. And this is particularly important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour to a natural area, and they walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. And they get back on the bus and they go home, and that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing, but it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and get to know it, interact with it, become comfortable with it, fall in love with it, alone. No parental supervision. Let them work it out alone. When we hover over our kids, we are sending the message that this is dangerous stuff. This is something you should be afraid of. And that is a terrible message to be sending to the future stewards of the planet. Our kids are afraid enough already, believe me. If they're afraid to be a good steward, if they don't know what good stewardship is, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature. It's a piece of grass with a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. Serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you learn how to take care of the lizard. You learn how to be a good steward of that piece of nature. And you fall in love with that piece of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture not too long ago, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember these experiences the rest of her life, and she will be a good steward of the planet. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it. It's a real thing. You go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on the biodiversity map. So the location of your property and then the amount of area you're going to be a good steward of, or maybe you already are being a good steward of. Maybe you're really going to reduce the area of lawn. You put that in the database. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. It doesn't matter how modest it is. And you don't have to have finished. This is kind of a pledge. And then your little piece of your county is going to light up with a firefly. And you get to see how many other people in your county have joined Homegrown National Park. And of course, the goal is to get the entire country to light up with fireflies. Our mission's very simple. We want to motivate millions of people to regenerate biodiversity in the way that you regenerate biodiversity, using the native plants that support biodiversity, and by removing the non-natives that do not. And in so doing, we're going to build a culture that's sympathetic to the needs of conservation. There are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and one of them is a significant increase in biodiversity. And when I look at what's happened at our house, I can tell you, it works. It works. Nature is really resilient. You put the plants back, it will come. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody removed the invasive plants just on their property, we'd be 78% done in the entire country. We'd be 85% done in the East. Not completely done, but that's a very good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the worst plant for sequestering carbon. So if we make a planting like this or anything else, you're going to sequester a lot more carbon in the plant material and in the ground than if you keep lawn. And you're also going to create viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Every bit of conservation we do outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of the park. There are also important sociological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and one is national awareness. Not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We're really trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not there just for our entertainment. It's not optional. It's essential. It's essential for everybody, which means everybody owns the responsibility of sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge existing conservation organizations like Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, all the land conservancies, wild ones. They're all doing wonderful conservation on private property, but we want to get that conservation recorded on the biodiversity map so we can see how well we're doing. How well we're doing towards the 30 by 30 initiative. You know, we're supposed to save 30% of the globe by 2030, 30% of the US by 2030. That is not going to happen if we don't count conservation on private property. It'll also show us where there's gaps, where we need to work harder, and so on. Did I mention Homegrown National Park is free? We're not trying to pull membership away from any other conservation organization. We're all on the same page. We just want to get everybody on the same page so we know how we're doing. Canada's playing this game now. We're talking to Great Britain, so we're off and running. So we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we put back in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to argue that at least some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is? It's the stone in the middle of the Roman arch. If you take it out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of the local food web, the food web collapses because those are the plants making most of the food. Those are the plants supporting the caterpillars that are most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillars that are out there. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They're essential. They're the support system. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last 100 years. What's the best keystone plant? Well, I've already mentioned it's one of our oaks. In the Mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars, over 950 species nationwide. Again, no other plant genus comes close to that. So how do you know what the best plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most important woody plant genera and herbaceous plant genera in your county will pop up. And this is just a shortened list because I ran out of room. So the old excuse of not knowing what to plant is just an excuse. We do know what to plant now. Go to Native Plant Finder. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. Turns out light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines around the world, particularly in temperate zones, and these are all the ways that lights are killing our nocturnal insects, particularly the moths that create the caterpillars that drive our food webs. This is actually good news to me. It's good news because this is a very, very serious environmental problem with a very, very simple solution. We just turn the lights out. There's a lot of us. We can do it. But I know you're not going to turn the light out because you're worried about the bad man. So, okay, put a motion sensor on your lights so that it only turns on when the bad man does come. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. They're called, you go to the hardware store, they're called bug lights. You think they're going to kill your bugs, but they don't. They're actually saving them. Nocturnal insects are not attracted to yellow wavelengths. So if we switched out white bulbs for yellow bulbs, overnight, we could save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, we could save millions of dollars as well. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system. Then we're going to invite one of the mosquito foggers to come kill all our insects. Booming business around the country. And they say it's okay because what we're fogging is a natural organic product and it only kills mosquitoes. I mean, if that were true, I would hire them. Natural and organic, maybe. You know, it's pyrethroids, which is the compound made by chrysanthemums. It's industrial strength pyrethroids, but, cyanide is natural and organic. Ricin is natural and organic. Being natural and organic does not necessarily mean safe. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. That's not even close to being true. That's blatant false advertising, kills all the insects it comes in contact with, including our beleaguered monarchs, This was a result of a mosquito fogging event in Kent Island. My friend happened to be there, and he picked up a handful of monarchs, but he said there were thousands on the ground. It was during a big migration event. It's killing the pollinators that we're working so hard to save. The interesting thing is it does not control mosquitoes. Yeah, it's true. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. It's too hard. You have to kill 90% of them to get good control. These guys kill on average around 40%. So they have to keep coming back and killing your monarchs all over again. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. You get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay or maybe some dead leaves, some organic material, put it out in the sun for a couple of days, let it build up populations of diatoms and algae, and that becomes an irresistible brew to local mosquitoes. The females will lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store, you buy a sheet of mosquito dunks. That's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera, and the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So it's targeted, it's cheap, and if everybody did it, it would work. This works too, by the way. Get a fan, put it on your picnic table. You can have your cocktail back there. The mosquitoes will not fly into directed breeze. You have to turn the fan on, but that works, and you don't have to kill anything. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows those all-important caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about how we landscape under our trees. So I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all over again. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species finish growing as caterpillars, and then they drop from the tree, wiggle their way underneath the soil, and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. It's messy. And we mow and compact the area around the tree so that it's rock hard, particularly in the summertime. And this becomes an ecological trap. Those are oak trees. They call in the adults to lay their eggs. The caterpillars develop, drop down, and good luck to them. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. Now, this is what most people do. You've got a tree in your yard. I just graduated Emma Jonas, a master's student, who studied how well caterpillars do in a situation like this versus a layered landscape like this. This is what Heather Holm calls a soft landing. The caterpillars fall down. And it's not that it's a soft landing, it's that it's a no-go zone. You've got plants there, so you're not mowing it, you're not walking on it, the soil is not compacted, there is leaf litter in there, everything those caterpillars need to have much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening around your trees. This is how you shrink the lawn. Put big beds around all your trees and you've got less lawn. So the trees will love it, and so will those caterpillars. You can use the available native plant ground covers like wild ginger. That's native pachysandra. There's Virginia creeper as a ground cover. Golden seal, mayapple, foam flower, ferns. If you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants. Green mulch is the way to go. Former grad student Desiree Narango did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and her results suggest that there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices, and that's good news. She had one simple question. She asked, how well do residential landscapes that are landscaped primarily with native plants support chickadee populations over time compared to landscapes that are planted primarily with non-native introduced ornamentals? And when they're planted with introduced ornamentals, they support 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you've reduced the bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now, every landscape, everybody in the study had a nest box up, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, not enough food here, we're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that into a population growth model, as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. This dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long. So if you breed at this level, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, anything above the dotted line, and that's what happens when you have very few non-native plants, then you have a growing population. But if you're below the line, that's what happens when you have a lot of non-native plants, you have an unsustainable shrinking population. And right there is where those lines intersect, which suggests very liberally that you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying your local food web. Now, we can't tolerate any invasive plants. Invasive plants are like, they're ecological tumors. They don't stay little, they expand. But there are a lot of ornamentals that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? That's a ginkgo tree. Did you pick that up the first time? Why does Dan have a ginkgo in his native plant landscape? Well, it turns out Dan's wife likes ginkgos, and Dan likes his wife, so he planted a ginkgo. The question is that tree going to destroy the functionality of this landscape? No, it's just there. Is it going to escape and become an invasive species? No, ginkgos don't move around. It's just there. So I like to think of plants that are just kind of occupying space. They're decorations, as if they're statues. So there's Dan's statue. If all of Dan's plants were statues, he would have a non-functional food web. So it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs, it's the absence of those productive native plants. If we increase the percentage of these, we can tolerate many of these. Can we use native plants in formal landscapes? Of course we can. It's a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken by a drone 400 feet up. You don't get more formal than that, and every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. They love them over there. If Europeans can love our native plants, maybe we can too. Can we get a pollinator garden into a suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. Formalizes it. Tells your neighbor it's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. It's not very big. Could be bigger. But if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? The media will tell you need pollinators because they're pollinating a third of our crops, as if that's the only reason we need pollinators. That's not true. It's about a 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators everywhere we need plants because they're pollinating 80% of those plants and 90% of our flowering plants. How about this? Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life here compared to the amount of life here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. The Minnesota's been doing it for a long time. They've got a cost-sharing program which helps Minnesota residents reduce or eliminate their lawn and replace it with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's a very popular program. Pennsylvania has a similar program, not that many years old. Virginia is starting a program like that. So it's starting to spread around. Very, very good idea. Marco Island in Florida is paying its residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. Listed species, it's an endangered species. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you actually use your property. Everybody would want an invasive species. I mean endangered species. Erase that. Put a bounty on, talk about invasive species, put a bounty on these invasive ornamentals like calorie pear. That's what Fayetteville, Arkansas did, St. Louis, Missouri, North Carolina. If you take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Public utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water-efficient native plants in the dry areas of our country. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in the far west, particularly California, that's going up now. It's now $3. For every square foot of lawn you remove in California, you get a $3 rebate. And if you want more information on all of those programs, memorize that. All All right, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and the first one's important. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like nature. It's not that we don't like it. We like it. We like to walk around and go bird watching, bike riding, but it's not essential. Which means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save wildlife, want to save nature so that future generations can enjoy it. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for expanding the national park system. Beautiful places, want to save them so that future generations can enjoy it. And I get that because nature is enormously entertaining, but it is much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And we talked about that. But if we restrict conservation just to the places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those places are too small, too few, and they are too isolated. David Quammen has a wonderful analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That's a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance, and I don't like that language because it suggests they're places without ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our campuses, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We've got to put the plants back. Not just to make biological corridors that connect isolated habitat fragments with each other, but to revegetate all those places where we've removed any habitat at all. And the good news is, it's starting to happen. It really is starting to happen. And when it does, it'll be the first time in modern history that we humans have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave conservation, earth stewardship, to a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, since every single person on the planet is entirely dependent on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody share the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. Mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching this. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good earth stewardship. That does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. More and more people recognize the earth has some serious issues, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can fire Mosquito Joe, one person can change their light bulb, one person can use native plants, one person can use keystone plants, remove invasive species. There's a whole bunch of things that one person can do on their property to revitalize their local ecosystem instead of continuing to degrade it. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for everybody. Don't worry about the entire planet's problems. You'd get depressed if you do that. Just think about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They are all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to change landscapes like this into landscapes like that. And whether or not we do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. Robert Swan recently said, the greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it. It's not going to be someone else. It's going to be you folks. I'll help. We'll do it together. You are nature's best hope. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a few questions. I know that's a long talk, and if you have to go, goodbye. I will repeat the question if you just yell it out.
About using Roundup to get rid of grass.
What about using Roundup to get rid of grass? Yeah. You know, Roundup, there are a number of herbicides to help remove plants. That's what herbicides do. It is a tool in our conservation toolbox. Problems from Roundup and from other herbicides come from its misuse and its overuse. But particularly if you're removing grass, you've got to kill the roots or it will keep coming back. It's not the only way to reduce grass. You can smother it with black plastic. You can use the lasagna method where you put layers of cardboard on. But they take weeks, months, sometimes as long as a year for it to be effective. The professionals use Roundup because then it's done. But used properly, it's like chemotherapy. If you got a tumor in your body, you got to kill it, so we get nasty with chemotherapy. But if you misuse it, not good. So it's a tool, it's an effective tool. You got to kill the roots of these invasive species. Let me just say, if you're, may not apply to lawn, but let's say you want to kill an autumn olive and you don't want to use any herbicide, cut it off at the base, cut out a square of black plastic from, say, a heavy garbage bag, and pin it to the ground around that stump, over that stump, using garden staples, and that's it. Leave it for a year. You're preventing any light from hitting that stump, and that will kill it without any herbicide. So it's more work, but you do it without herbicide. So it's up to you. Is there a way to make your lawn better without totally getting rid of it? Yes, and adding white clover is one of those ways. So what you're doing, I mean, when I was growing up, all the lawns had white clover in it. That's how you get to experience your first bee sting, by running around with bare feet. But it adds a plant that generalist pollinators, particularly our honeybees and some of the bumblebees, will go to. And if you don't have that, then your lawn is contributing nothing. So yes, that is better. It's also adding nitrogen to your lawn, so you don't need any more fertilizer, which is a big plus. But the real way to help your property is to have less lawn that you still manicure. So it's a cue for care. Your neighbors won't hate you. They know what the culture is. But you're going to have more well-planted areas. But you can have clover in that area you leave as well. But I encourage you, rather than thinking clover is going to solve all the problems of lawn, it's going to help. But you can do better. Now, you know what? Despite my wonderful hearing aids, I missed a crucial word. Lesser celandine. Ah, yeah. It is pretty. You're right. But boy, is that invasive. It just really, really spreads. It comes from little teeny bulblets. It is really hard to get rid of. The good thing about lesser celandine is it blooms and then it dies back and it's gone the rest of the season. And other plants will come up within it. But it's competitive. It is outcompeting many of our good natives. So I certainly wouldn't buy it and I wouldn't encourage it.
Do you have any bee hotels or bug snugs on your property? I hear they're in vogue, but if you have native plants, do you need them?
Okay, I don't know where you are, but bee hotels, oh, you're over there, okay. Bee hotels provide a nesting site for the bees that use tunnels in wood. And in our typical suburban yards, we don't leave any dead wood around. So in that sense, they do help. There are better ways to do it. First of all, if you make a big bee hotel, it makes all the bees nest in one place, and if the predators and diseases find it, you get wiped out. And if you're going to use bee hotels, it's better to have many smaller ones that you put around your property in a place where it's not going to get wet. It wants to be protected from rain. I did notice the other day, I've got a very old wood pile. I didn't get a chance to actually use the wood, and now it's starting to rot. And I was going to actually take it apart the other day. I went there. All the bees are all around it. They're using it as a nesting site. It's not a bee hotel. It's just a natural area where they would normally nest. So if you have a place where you can put some natural wood, that's even better. If you find a log, fresh, maybe a fairly fresh log, and stand it up that tall, the beetles in there that will tunnel out and they leave holes, and the bees use those holes too. So all you have to do is stand up a log and it becomes a bee nesting site. You can buy a bee hotel, but you have to keep them clean. That's the hard part. I'll repeat it. You talking about Japanese beetles? Okay, Japanese beetles came in with ornamentals 100 years ago, spreading across the country. As adults, they're generalists. They eat a lot of things, particularly your roses. They really like sycamore leaves. As larvae, they're specialists on grass roots. When we have 44 million acres of grass roots, we make a lot of Japanese beetles. I don't have a Japanese beetle problem in my yard anymore because my neighbor who had 10 acres of grass has moved, and the new people have put in a meadow. So we've reduced the food source for the Japanese beetle. I have a little bit of lawn, paths where I walk and thing, but the Japanese beetle population has been very low. If you really want to control Japanese beetles, there's a product called milky spore disease. It's very slow. It will kill Japanese beetles, but not really quickly, and you have to spread it all over the place. But the best way to control Japanese beetles is to remove their food source, and that's, less lawn is going to help that. Yeah, the adults did. Right, yeah, the adults are pretty generalized. They'll eat a lot of things.
How did you protect from deer pressure on your property?
Ooh. That, I would rank that as the #1 challenge to any kind of gardening, but particularly native plant gardening. The reason we have, it seems like these super powerful, competitive, non-native plants spreading throughout every place, it's not because they're competitive plants, it's because the deer don't eat them. They eat all the natives, and they don't eat autumn olive, and they don't eat porcelain berry, and they don't eat all that stuff. So, of course, what's left is just solid understory of non-natives. The list of problems from deer is a big, long one, and I've had Lyme disease 5 times, so I get it. We've got way too many deer. They are around 10 times over the carrying capacity, and they're causing all kinds of problems to the regeneration of our forest. How do you control them? Hunting. The problem is they are living in suburbia where we can't hunt. All right, you can hire sharpshooters, very expensive. They might get half of them, not nearly enough. You'd have to do it all the time. That has not proven to be effective. Bern Blassie at Cornell says we have to return to market hunting. Market hunting is where you hunt the deer and sell the meat. Look at how well it controlled those pesky bison. Not a problem anymore. Passenger pigeon, haven't seen one in a long time. So it works, but it would have to change a lot of rules and have to be well regulated. But they're not just going to disappear on their own.
Do you have a top 3 favorite native plants to recommend to someone with a small yard?
Well, the top 3 native plants I would recommend to a small garden. Is that the question? Yeah.
Yes.
Does this small garden have sun?
Sure.
In that case, for a small space, I would try to make the most powerful pollinator garden that I could. And that means you're going to plant for bee specialists because the generalists use those plants as well. And the top 3 plants in this area for bee specialists are any of the goldenrods, perennial sunflowers, and asters, native asters. If you have those 3 genera in your garden, you can support up to 40 species of bees in this area that won't be there if you don't have them. So that's what I would do.
Oh, we have over here? Here, let me pass it.
Yes.
Go ahead, pass it.
Yes. Is noise pollution a problem? With mowers and blowers, does that disrupt?
Does noise pollution cause a problem? You know, there's more and more research looking at how it impacts particularly birds. And yes, they try to find areas that are less noisy. You know, birds talk to each other all the time. So near highways where you've got roaring traffic all the time, the bird communication is disrupted. I don't know that much about it, but does it cause problems? Yeah. Are they top among all the things that are happening out there? Not sure about that. It sure causes problems for me, especially with my new hearing aids.
Hi. My question pertains to the ideal diameter of an herbaceous stratum around a tree. I know for tree root conservation, you kind of picture the wine glass on the dinner plate. Is it the target, the drip line? Is it further than that?
It should be at least to the drip line. Again, the bigger the better. If your tree's sitting in a big meadow, then you've got a savanna-like landscape, and that's the best of all. But going to the drip line, and for a large tree, that's a good size garden. And people say, I don't have to plant all that. That's where you rake your leaves. That's where you put your leaves. It doesn't have to be totally planted. It just has to be a no-go zone where you're not compacting it or mowing it. And it'll be great for those caterpillars. And you're returning the nutrients that are in those leaves to the roots of that tree. You're holding water a whole lot better than your lawn does. There are more things that live in leaves than above ground, so it's a super place for biodiversity, even though they're small and you don't usually see them. So there's a lot of pluses to keeping the leaves under your trees, and the bigger the area you do it, the better. But at least to the drip line.
Hi, so the phrase structure dictates function. We see this in microbiology, we see it in engineering and a lot of other natural forms in this world, but we also see it in landscaping. Is there a specific structure that increases the efficiency of biodiversity in landscapes that you have seen?
Well, I'll be really simplified about that and just say a 3-dimensional structure is really good as opposed to 2-dimensional. Right now, we've got plants on the ground, and we've got canopy with nothing in between. So the more we can fill in that understory with shrubs and understory trees, the more biodiversity you're gonna create. Another key, of course, to biodiversity is access to sun. As we build closed-in forests, you actually lose diversity compared to edges and more sunny areas. So the perfect landscape, structure-wise, has trees, has canopy trees, has some planted close together so they don't all blow over when the rains and winds, but it also has a lot of sun. So the savanna landscapes of the Midwest, oak savannas, highly diverse landscapes from the old days. And we can create that in suburbia pretty easily. She's desperate.
One more. One more question.
Invasive praying mantises.
Invasive praying mantises. What do I do with praying mantids? So you're talking about the Chinese mantid for the most part. Yeah, they make the globular egg mass. Right now, good time to find them. The easiest way to deal with it is to clip off that egg mass and put them in the freezer.
Are they bad?
They're large insects. They have been recorded eating hummingbirds a number of times. They'll hang from a hummingbird feeder to do that. They sit near flowers and they pick off all your bees as they come in. We have native manads. We got the Carolina manad, and they certainly outcompete them. So are they bad? They're not good. How about that? Are we done?
Can we thank this gentleman for a wonderful... Fabulous message. I'm so excited to be sharing it with all of you. And I wanted to let you know that there are still some of the native plant nursery people out in the lobby, and we still have some refreshments. Dr. Tallamy is still going to be doing book signings. And we have just started a Homegrown National Park Bucks chapter. I started it, and I am terrible with social media and anything like that. So if there's anyone that wants to coordinate that for us, I have a list of people that are starting to do it, and we should get together. So thank you so much for coming.